Hello, this is National Chess Master R. Rats here at chess.com. I'm starting a series on opening the Nimzovitch defense. Here you can see it's identifying moves 1e4 and knight c6. This is just going to be an introduction video covering the main ideas and the main lines, and then I'm going to go in depth and tear it apart bit by bit with a video series. And let's talk about this position just for a moment. Okay, it's named after Aaron Nimzovitch. Often he would play one knight c3 followed by e3 and develop his style of play, and then later he adopted the black side using that system as black. And so some of the ideas that black can do, white can do too, and I'll cover all these things down the line. Let's consider what are the main alternatives here for white. Okay, the most common response by far is d4. Players are conditioned to know when they can open with e4 and d4 that they're going to do it. And let's just back up and I'll show you what are the other lines. Knight f3 is often seen. White is trying to say, well, I would like to play a regular king pawn opening. You're welcome to play 2e5 and then I'll play my normal stuff against you. And black doesn't have to oblige, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And then there's lesser moves that really aren't too much difficulty. Knight c3 can come into play, and f4, that's not too bad to face. But like I say, the majority of the games are going to come with d4. This is just a simple fact. Okay, now there are a lot of ways for black to approach this. Let's talk about it for a moment. One move that I don't play, but it's perfectly playable in this position, is to play e5. Now, if white wants, white can go into the Scotch game with knight f3, and black needs to be prepared for that. And let's just take a quick look at the couple of the other ideas. One is to take here, and the idea being an open position is the best way for white to try to get an advantage, but actually black equalizes just about in every line here. And one sad thing about the Nimzovitch defense is the lack of material published on it. Back in 1973, a national chess master by the name of Hugh Myers published a work on the Nimzovitch defense, and he later updated it in 1986, 93, and 95, and he has since passed away. And any of those books are classics. I have the latter three, and there's a wealth of information in them. And a Polish player by the name of Kapitaniak, I believe, wrote one about 30 years ago, and then international master David Harding, or Tim Harding, someone from England, wrote a book about 30 years ago. But none of them really cover, they're all kind of outdated, and theory on the Nimzovitch has pretty much remained stagnant simply because top-flight grandmasters just won't adopt it. Now, a few random ones here and there have played it, but it hasn't gotten a huge following. And I really don't understand why, because for those that are just tired of playing normal book openings, the Nimzovitch defense is a great opening, and it's full of opening traps, just like about any opening you would. And I'll show a few of those to you here. Now, what the other more common response instead of going into a Scotch is just to play d5. And the idea here that black has is he wants to play knight to g3, g6, and the other knight to f3, and if he can, bishop to c5, and eventually run some kind of kingside attack. That's just the basic idea, and I won't go into depth about all the plans on that. This is just an introduction video. And let's back it up just a wee bit, and let's consider d4 again. Now, another move that's possible a la Nimzovitch is to play e6, and sometimes this can get into similar positions to the French, the Guimard variation. If white plays knight c3, black can play d5, and I'm not going to go into great depth on this. This is a line I don't play, but I'm aware of it. I know I've probably tried it once or twice just to experiment. Black accepts a kind of a cramped game, but his long-term prospects are fine. He'll just play a positional game, and I'll cover this down the line in my series. But the far most common move, and the one I prefer, is d5, and this is the defining point of the Nimzovitch defense. And once again, there are three main lines that white can play from this position, and I'll just show them to you one by one. The most common response is to push by with e5, and then another response is to take on d5, and it's similar to the Scandinavian defense in a number of respects. And probably the one the masters prefer is a temporary pawn gambit with knight c3, and I'll go into each of these individually and cover some of the ideas. Okay, so on d5, as I was saying, e5 is the most common response. Now, black has a number of options, the most common being bishop c4, and this is the move I prefer. And immediately, the game starts taking on some interesting characteristics. Okay, if you look at black's position, in effect, kind of what he's doing is he's going to be playing like it's like an advanced French defense, where an advanced variation of the French defense where black has developed his light squared bishop. We know this doesn't happen in a normal French defense. That black suffers with that French bishop for a long time and desperately tries to get it into play. Well, here the problem is solved. But however, there are drawbacks to the fact that bishop got free, and the defining drawback is the fact that black's knight is on c6, and this prohibits black from advancing c5, which is a common theme. It can be done later with preparation, but for the moment that's the trade-off. It's also similar in some respects to a Caro-Kann advanced variation. And once again, though, the black knight is on c6 and blocking it, but this doesn't blocking that c-pawn. But this doesn't mean that black has a bad game at all, just because he can't advance the c-pawn. The key to this variation revolves around the square f5. This is black's square. He's going to secure that square for a piece. He's going to keep a bishop there as long as he can, and when the bishop finally gets traded, and it usually will, black will endeavor to drop a knight into that square, and I'll cover that in just a minute. Okay, so the first trap that we can run into, and I actually run into this quite a lot in blitz chess. White will just look at this and kind of play it like a Caro-Kann and play bishop d3, and this is just a blunder that drops a pawn. After knight takes d4, white has nothing. He's going to lose his pawn, and I've had both bishop takes f5 played, and I've had c3 played, and in either case black just comes out a pawn ahead. Okay, so immediately it sets some pitfalls for white. So I'll just give you an idea. The most common line is to play c3. Another popular line, knight f3 or knight e2, and I'll go into depth on both of those later, what some of the strategies are. They'll be similar to what I'm going to show you here in the main line. Okay, so bishop f5, and as I say, c3. Now, we reach a divergence in the beginning when I adopted this back in 1986. When I adopted this opening regularly, I'd been playing a little bit before, but I entered into ICCF Masterclass correspondence tournaments and started really digging into the nuances of this opening. I would tend to play e6 here, and it's not a bad move at all, but finally I got away from it. Not that I wasn't happy with it, I was, and I've opted more so and with regularity to play f6, and I'll just basically show you the ideas with this. Okay, commonly what's going to happen is white's just going to naturally react with f4. Okay, this is fine. We take, and now we play e6. And if you look at this position, here, black has got two pieces out, and white has none, and black is ready to develop the rest of his pieces. There is one little problem piece for black in this opening, and it's this bishop on f8. It sometimes gets in the way, and I'll show you how to handle that. And I'll just, like I say, I'll go over a couple of main ideas here. Sometimes it has to just sit there for a while, but eventually it will get played. Okay, so what can happen from this position is white will just continue with knight f3, and then black can play knight e7, and then let me actually, you know what? I'm going to show you just a little different. I want to get to a main point because I'm not trying to cover every variation. Okay, white will play bishop d3, and then a common response is to play knight ge7. Now, white doesn't necessarily have to take on f5, but I'm just going to show you what happens when he does take on f5, because the purpose of this is just to give you the ideas. Okay, at any point, if white pushes g4, black has knight h4 in response. The knight's going to drop in there, and there could be some threats to the king position. And but let me just illustrate what essentially can happen in this variation. Okay, now the bishop goes to e7. As I said, it's going to get in the way, but we need to do that to get the king castled. Okay, then white castles and black castles. So this is just a sample line just to give you an idea. We're not trying to teach you every single variation, because principles are the guidance more so than variations. We want to understand what we're trying to do here, and as I've already said, black is endeavoring to keep a piece on f5, and in some cases black will even push pawn to h5 to help secure that knight, or if it's a bishop, if the bishop didn't get traded, to keep that piece on f5 and hold that square. Okay, now white needs to develop his queen side, so let's continue with just like I say, I want to give you some sample ideas. Now, as I say, this bishop's in the way. What black would like to do is transfer a knight to e7, but the bishop's in the way. So the remedy I've found is, it doesn't have to be this way, but it can be queen d7, and I want to show you the basic ideas. Okay, now sometimes what white will do at some point is play knight b3, and the idea is to come in here to c5. Well, the moment white plays knight b3, black just responds with b6, keeping the knight out. Okay, now white has to be careful. It's probably a mistake to play the bishop to g5, because black will just happily trade it off. Then he's got a clear path to knight to e7. So let's just park the king in the corner, get him out of this possible danger. I'm just trying to illustrate an idea, and then black will play rook e8, and then let's try queen e2. Now here's the maneuver. The bishop comes back to d8, and again the purpose of that was to bring the knight on c6 over to e7 so they can transfer on over. Now let's just put the white bishop on d2. Now at this point, if black plays knight e7, white gets g4 in. So this might be a point where black plays h5. Let's just do it and get it out of the way. Okay, now rook e1, and now knight e7, and now white decides, for instance, well, the knight's not going anywhere on b3. I'll remaneuver it, and then black plays knight g6, and then knight d3, and this is just a slow maneuvering game that black is quite happy to go into. Suddenly he's going to start doubling up his rooks, and maybe white offers an exchange here. Well, he's got to be careful. There could be some discoveries on that bishop. So let's like I said, I'm just kind of wasting moves here just to give you an idea of what we're trying to do. And now black has succeeded in doubling his rooks, and at some point what's going to happen here is black's going to doesn't have to do it now, he could do it later. He's going to play his bishop to e7 and later break with c5. Now how can white combat this setup? Because black's just had a pretty free reign of doing exactly what he wants to do. Here we are we've played 19 moves, and white hasn't done anything against the black position, and black has just maneuvered his way, and getting the kind of game he wants. He's going to look to push with h4 at some point. Maybe move his knight to h6. He's not worried if it gets taken off. It'll just open up another file for him to possibly attack on. And Black's got some definite kingside attacking chances, and I'll send some illustrative games on your way later with more videos to show how this is done. So how else can White combat this? Well, sometimes people will try to break with c4 at some point, but all that does is it gives Black this wonderful outpost on d5 to occupy. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into detail on this, but more than this until I can actually show an illustrative game. But this is the strategy that Black will employ against the advanced variation, and there are some variations of it. Let's just go back to the beginning and cover just a couple of other sidelines. Okay, sometimes what White will do, and I think this is a mistake, is to play knight f3. And this helps Black a lot, because now when Black takes on e5, he's going to end up getting control of c5 no matter how White retakes. If White retakes with the knight, then we have this, and then suddenly comes e6, and the problem that this dark squared bishop had in the last variation is solved. It's got a wonderful diagonal. Okay, so that's just another little idea of this opening. In some points, White will try to pin. Let's see, where are we? White will try to pin this knight, and that's not something we need to worry too much about. Black doesn't need to worry too much if he gets double pawns here, because eventually one can push to c5, and with due preparation, and if once it trades off, the other one goes to c5, and Black's going to end up with a protected pass pawn on d5. So I'll cover some games later where White plays bishop b5, but just to suffice it to say, Black has resources against it. Okay, so let's go back and start the opening again, and I've pretty much covered the main ideas of e5. What about e takes d5? Okay, e takes d5. This is, as I mentioned, is similar to a Scandinavian defense, and there's one gambit I've run into a few times that Black has no problem against. It's where White sacrifices a pawn for rapid development. And I'll just show you the variation. And now the key is to just block that d file so Black gets ready to castle. And if White tries to exploit things, Black just plays rook c8, and he's ready to play a6. And I've actually had people play knight takes a7 on me, and this just loses the game because of b6, and rook a8 is coming, and Black really doesn't have any kind of, or White doesn't really have a defense against this. So let's just get down to the nitty-gritty and see what happens if White doesn't gambit. Knight f3 is the main move, but now Black has a couple of interesting choices here. One I'm not going to go into detail now. I've never played it, but I'm well aware of it. Is bishop g4, and this often involves an exchange sacrifice, and it gets wild and crazy, and I'll share that another time. But the move I like to play here is simply e5, and here's this. Now the Nimzovitch defense takes on a whole new light. Let's just talk about this for a moment. From a Black point of view, you've got open lines for both your bishops. Your knight's ready to go. Other knight's ready to come out. None of your pawns, pawn islands, are weak. Everything is intact. The pawns, all on Black's second rank, are connected. None of them is advanced, and therefore Black has no weaknesses on that pawn structure. And when you can find an opening where those pawns don't move, you're in pretty good shape. So just from this, Black's getting everything he wants, and he's going to get at least an even game. And let's consider just a couple ideas. The first is there's a temporary pawn sacrifice here that Black will employ, and really he doesn't have anything to worry about. Black has a lot of good moves here. One is bishop c5, just putting the question to this pawn. And if the king runs over to guard it, suddenly c2 is weak, and black gets some counterplay on that. And if bishop e3, black can just take it, and this pawn will eventually be surrounded and won. The knight will go to e7 and g6, and eventually black's going to regain his pawn, and then white has this isolated pawn here, which is really no good. And if white tries something else, well, actually, let me just show you this. This is another line here is just bishop g4. Now the threat is to play knight takes pawn here. Now we want this one instead of this one. And the other nice thing about bishop g4 is now black is getting ready to castle with check, and he will still follow up and regain the pawn on e5 at his leisure. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other ideas. So generally it's not good for white to take that, although he's just giving black an even game. The more challenging moves here are to play something like knight c3, and then black has to pin that piece. Now this takes on the flavor of a Scandinavian, but there's a few differences in it. And now black parts with the bishop pair, and then plays e4, and we can run into knight here. And now black can play this move, and even though he's parted with the bishop pair, he is rock solid. The pawn on e5 is weak. The pawn on e4 is actually pretty strong. It might take a little work to win that pawn on e5, but if black can do it and hold on to his pawn on e4, he's clear pawn up. So this is, again, some of the possibilities that one can run into. And if white tries in any way, shape, or form to refute this early, black just has a number of resources at his disposal. c4 is premature because black has a check, and then on bishop e2, now you're opening up a file on your king, but you're also winning a critical pawn. And white's trying to remaneuver so he can pin the queen, but black has plenty of time to react against that. Just bishop e7 here is fine. Bishop e6 would be fine, and black is just going to be a pawn up and secure it home to victory. So white doesn't have a whole lot of tricks at his disposal. It's basically going to end up in even position, and as black, that's what you want. You want to be able to equalize in the opening. Okay, so that covers the second line. Let's consider what I said at the outset was what masters will try to do is they'll try to play knight c3. Now there's a great divergence in this opening. There's a lot of variations that are critical. Once again, black can play e6 if he's uncomfortable with all the other things that can happen. Black even has this interesting move. You might be shocked, but this is actually quite playable, and I'll illustrate this at a later time. e5 is a nice move. Knight f6 is an interesting move, and it can transpose into when white plays knight c3 on the second move. And I mentioned that was a possibility. I'll go ahead and show it. Okay, this is actually interesting. e5, and then knight d7. And I've had several people look at this and say, oh, gee, this is great. I'm winning a pawn, and black has nothing. And knight takes d5. And if you look at that, it looks like black has just butchered it. White wants to counterattack on that knight, and if you take on e5, the pawn on d4 retakes on e5, and the knight is now protected by the queen. So, but what people miss is black has this very clever little move here at his disposal, and it's knight from d7 to b8. And now the knight's attacked on d5, and if it doesn't retreat this move, it's going to have to retreat next move. There's two ways to protect it, with either c4 or bishop c4. And in either case, black is going to play e6, forcing the knight to retreat, and then black plays queen takes d4, regaining his pawn, and he has at least an equal game. So again, one of these little subtle tricks that are available in Nimzovitch defense. But let's get into what I consider the main line, and that's d takes e4. And there's a gambit by white. I won't get into it, but white can try f3, and it's not bad. He's going to get some development for his pawn. But the main line that seems to, well, actually, before I show you the main line, you can't really play knight takes because d4 is hanging. That's why this is, as I mentioned, is a gambit. d5 is the main move here. Now, there is one line, I've never used it, but it's playable, and that's just to bring the knight back to d8. And the reason I don't do it is I just don't like having to bring the knight back to d8 when I don't have to. Now, in the other game I just illustrated, the king's knight ended up going over to b8, but there was a point to it. But knight b8 is playable, and I'm not going to go into it, but knight e5 is the critical move. And if white plays knight takes e4, and often he will, black has nothing at all to fear here. He will equalize with c6. And I've even run into c4 and e6, and then white tries d6, and this just ends up losing that pawn down the line. And no matter how white plays it, white's going to win that pawn. And white has a few tricks up his sleeve for it, but it doesn't really matter. He's not going to be able to get c5 in. I won't go into this now. I'll show a game with it later. I'm trying to conserve time and just make this an introduction video. Okay, so really knight takes c4 is not a problem. But here we have what we consider the basic main lines. And the main line is queen d4. That's the one main move, and the other main line is bishop f4, and I'll cover an introduction to both of those momentarily. First, queen d4. Then what black does is play knight g6. Now, years and years and years ago, maybe 70 years ago, Reuben Fine, American Grandmaster, recommended queen a4 check, bishop d7, and queen b3. This was Reuben Fine's suggestion, and white was supposed to have a slight advantage. I have played against this before. I know how to handle it. I'll show that down the line. Okay, there are some tricks here that, though, as I mentioned, that white has to watch out for. They could fall into them real quickly, and if you're black, you want to be ready for them. The first one is an immediate bishop b5 check. Oops, missing something. Now you can do that check now. I'm thinking of something else. I'm sorry. Okay. This is the point where now the queen takes e4. Yeah, now I'm showing you the trick. Okay, now knight f6. Now this is the point where bishop b5 check is a mistake, and I've actually had some very high-rated players play that against me. And black just gets his way here. c6. And now you know, look at all these discoveries that white has. Well, first off, if c7 check, black just puts his queen on d7, and he's going to end up a piece ahead. Well, you ask, well, what about pawn takes? Well, that's kind of interesting. Pawn takes. We have d7. Now, you're hoping that he takes back with the queen, and then you make a new queen down here on e8, but black has this resource, king takes, and white can scream. He's losing. Black will win that pawn on b7 momentarily, and he's going to be up material, no matter how white does it. So there's some, like I say, there's some ways for white to go wrong in this opening. Okay, so on queen takes e4, now black gets this tempo on the queen. Now there's a possibility to check on a4, and then you can put the bishop here, and then bishop b5, and then an a6, and black should be fine here. The main line continues with queen takes, you know, this exchange, and then knight d7. Knight takes on d7, and black should be fine here. He's going to work to get this bishop on f8 out, but eventually it will get developed, and black has a decent game. I think on knight f3, black just plays h6 to keep the knight out of g5 so that black can castle long. And I know at some point there's an American postal master that runs a column for Chess Life, Alex Dunn. He liked to play knight c5 in this position. I never understood that exactly. let's see, just go back. He would play knight c5 here because I guess he invited this weakening move because on b4 black has to go back, and Dunn would play this religiously and get away with it, and I can maybe cover some of that down the line. But there's a lot of nuances here. Black should be fine. He's got equality, and but let me go to a couple more critical lines just to get them out of the way. Okay. I pretty much covered most of the main ideas behind Queen d4. Bishop f4 is the critical move here, and once again there is a divergence here. Black has two main lines here, and each one has its pluses and minuses. a6 costs a tempo, but it takes this critical b5 square away from white, and it can come in handy for white. And I've played this many times, and I've had some interesting results with it, both wins and losses. And when I have lost, I've gone back to the drawing board to try to find something better. The other main idea here is to play f5, and this it lets white stay in control of b5, but it saves a tempo, because often black will even play this in the a6 line, and immediately there's some tricks on the bishop, and there's a lot of tactics in here, and to try to solve it here in this video would not do it justice. But suffices to say that if black's prepared here, he should be fine. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's just go back to the main position, and I talked about knight c3 for a moment. Black is just fine to go ahead with knight f6 here, and he doesn't have to fear d4. He can play d5 as I showed, and any other moves like f4 he can play d5, and even if knight f3, it's perfectly acceptable to go into 4 knights defense, and black should have no trouble equalizing with that. Other moves besides knight f3 really shouldn't cause black any difficulty, but let's cover knight f3. Now there's a lot of choices that black can do here, and it depends on your style more than anything. One is you can kind of play it French defense style with e6, and you can even do d6, and then it's kind of perk style. The bishop will go to g4 probably. It may have to liquidate itself for this knight, and then black will just play hedgehog style, pawn to g6 and pawn to e6, and black should be fine, get at least an even game there. He'll be a little cramped, but he'll equalize. d5 is more wide open, and it's similar in some respects to what I showed you with the other variations of the Nimzovitch defense, where white's taking on d5. It can actually transpose right into it. If white plays d4, there you've got it. You're in that main line again. Or if you prefer, when I show you the other lines with bishop g4, you can go for this line. Okay, so, and I think those lines continue. Like I said, it involves an exchange sacrifice, and it gets very, 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 very tricky. And I think king d7 is the key move, and I'm not going to analyze it out, but it's a very, very intriguing line, and one that if you're prepared can help get you points from either side of the board. Okay, so let's consider what are our other alternatives against this. One I like to play, I call it the Fred, Nimzovitch Fred for short, or Fred for short, Nimzovitch Fred. E4, F5 is the Fred, so this is the Nimzovitch Fred, but I just call it the Fred for short, as I said. And actually the opening has a name, and it was misnamed, unfortunately. This opening was popularized back in the 1970s by future international master Douglas Root in Southern California. He was playing this against really strong masters and beating them. He was playing it against everybody. And finally, somebody wrote a letter to the editor of Chess Life and had a question about this opening, and he happened to live in Colorado, and it was Ask the Master or something like that, and they made a response. And anyway, in one of Hugh Meyer's books, he mentioned this opening, and because the letter writer was from Colorado, he just called it the Colorado defense. Well, it wasn't the Colorado defense at all, because it wasn't played in Colorado. It was played by Root. It should be the Root counterattack to the Nimzovitch defense. But well, no, chess openings don't always get named as they should. This is just another one. But suffice it to say, black really will shock white here. And I'm not afraid to play this. I haven't played it lately, but I have played it. I've played it in some. I've played against masters over the board and beaten them. I played it in high-level correspondence. I was in a World Championship semifinal of the world and played it against a Soviet player, and I beat him rather quickly. And I ended up winning a gold medal for Team USA in the Pacific Area Team Tournament 3. And I played against an Australian master, and I won that game rather quickly. And the game was published in Inside Chess and Chess Life and a few other places. And I remember the commentator in Inside Chess, that was Sirawan's old magazine, said something like, although I certainly wouldn't recommend this opening for black, it's quite interesting. And I'm not going to go into all the details of all this, but let me just suffice it to say there's some main lines of divergence. If white plays knight c3, you can go into a Schliemann defense. You can still transpose into it. And it's in one of those lines where black is taking on e4. Okay? And if white pushes e5, black can do just fine with d6 here. And then if d4, you take. And one way or the other, if he retakes on e5, he can gambit the pawn, but black's okay with that. Black's going to trade queens, stop white from castling, and just consolidate. And I'll show you just the main idea there. Okay. Now we happily trade queens, and then we play bishop e6. Now this bishop's not very good. It's kind of stuck, but we'll get it out later. And black will just hunker down, play bishop d7. Knight e7, the knight might go to d5, it might go to g6, it might go to c6, we don't know yet. And this bishop will find a diagonal, probably c5. It might even go to g7 if we want to counter on e5. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities here, but black should be okay against this. But what's most interesting about this, Fred, is, well, what happens if white takes the pawn? That seems to be the natural move. And I found this gambit in Hugh Meyer's book back in the 80s, and it's just crazy, d5. And I've actually played this against strong computers, and I used to beat them until they found the bug, and they were tired of losing to me at like an ICC. I'd go in there, I'd beat Colossus, and then they had to fix it so that nobody could do this anymore. But it's a very, very interesting gambit. I will just show you the opening moves. Okay, knight h4. Black attempts to hold on to the pawn. And then white tries to hold on to the pawn. Now black plays this shocking move e5, and you look at that and you say, you can't do that. You just can't. Well, here I'll show you. Queen h5 check, and suddenly the black king's got trouble. Okay, so g6. Then white takes the pawn, and black develops his knight, and then comes this discovered check, and you take the queen, and then the queen is reborn, and black is down the exchange and a pawn. But suddenly his pieces have sprung to life, and black has this very interesting attack going on here. There's a lot of ways for white to go wrong, and it's in one of these lines that I would beat the computers, because it recognized that it was up major material, and the computer's weakness is it has something it's called a horizon effect. It can only see so many moves deep, and once you get it past that horizon, all of a sudden there's something that comes up that it didn't anticipate earlier, and suddenly there's no reply for it. And I'm not going to get into all the details of all of this, but suffice it to say that, like for instance on queen takes h7, suddenly the black game is getting very potent. Now there's a threat of bishop f5, followed by queen e4 check, and black gets a lot of potential mates in here. And again, I'm not going to go into the long detail. There's interesting tries with bishop b5 check and so forth, but I'll have to go into detail later when I illustrate this. But if you learn this line as black, it's a terrific line to play in blitz chess. But let's just go back and see what's more likely to happen. Okay, what's most likely to happen is that white will play d4, and then you take. Now on f5. Now black has voluntarily accepted a backward pawn on the open file, but this isn't necessarily a major concern. Black has plenty of resources here. The two main moves that I run into are bishop d3 and bishop b5. On bishop d3, usually I just play queen d7, and I'll follow up with g6 and bishop g7, knight f6, and I'll castle. Okay, that's kind of the strategy I use. And the other main line is bishop b5, but oops, gotta back it up to play to bishop b5. Okay, bishop b5, and now knight f6 comes in, and it's interesting the resources that black has here in this position. Suddenly there comes this this move, and then queen d6, and then white castles, and white's really happy with his game here. He's just got this pin, and he's got this knight on a nice outpost, but suddenly there comes this move, knight d7, and black has some threats here. So for instance on f4, you're going to take with this knight, breaking the pin. And then on f takes c5, you swing the queen over, and you've gotten out of the pin. You're getting ready for c6. You're on c2, and it's a very interesting game develops. And black has resources and a very playable game. And again, I can't go into everything about this. I'll share all of this down the line later with you. Okay, so let's back it up and go through this one more time. Okay, f5. d3 is not really a move that black need to fear. You can just exchange on e4 and play e5, or just play d6, slow play it, and followed by knight f6, and not let this white bishop come out to c4. It's not going to be a problem. Okay, so what else is there in this Fred? But suffice it to say, you've got to be bold to go into that one gambit I showed, and a well-prepared player. I do believe it's cooked. I found something that I haven't been able to refute yet. But black still has a lot of active play, and I'll share all that later. But suffice to say, the Nimzovitch defense is certainly an interesting opening. It takes white out of just about everything he's prepared for. It gives black a fighting chance. He'll get some new winning chances, a lot of free play that he might not normally get if he chose a Sicilian or a Rue Lopez or French defense. White's going to have to swim on his own, and that's what I like to do. When I play somebody that I've never played before, I want them more into my style of game rather than the style of game they are playing. And if you look at my online games here at chess.com, I'm playing a lot of Nimzovitch defenses. I'm getting a lot of interesting games with them. They don't show all of the themes that I've employed. Nobody has gone into anything but the e5 line, or they've played knight f3 against me. Nobody's taken on d5 yet. Nobody's played three knight c3. I guess I'll run into them eventually if I keep playing. I don't know, but I've got a wealth of knowledge on this opening that I'm willing to share. And if you feel your chess is a little stale and needs some refreshment, these Nimzovitch defense videos could be just exactly what you're looking for, and we'll get into more of those in the very near future. But suffice it to say, this opening is for real, and no matter what other people say about it, they're not going to be able to refute it unless they're 200 or 300, 400 points ahead of you. And even then, if you know the opening better than they do, they're going to be in for the fight of their life. So if you want to learn a new opening for black, you've come to the right place. Stick with me. I'll share it all. All right. Thank you so much for your time. That concludes this promotion video on the Nimzovitch defense, and there will be many, many more of them yet to come. And I'll make a whole new section for them on my website. You can find that linked here in the description on the YouTube channel. All right. Take care. Thanks.